think we should probably get started.
Yep.
Hello to everyone who's joining us. This event is being organized by ICNA, Council for Social Justice, CSJ. And actually, before we get started with that, I want to bid everyone a wonderful Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. And yeah, thank you for joining us. And for those of you who don't know, ICNA, Council for Social Justice, is a grassroots social justice human rights organization that strives to systematically facilitate assertive Muslim involvement in the field of human struggle for the rights of the poor and oppressed in the United States and also around the world through education, interfaith, partnership, coalition, public advocacy, civic engagement. And I also wanted to mention, give a brief little shout out to our co-sponsors for this event. Let's give a shout out to Jewish Voice for Peace. One of our speakers is from that organization, and we'll go ahead and introduce her in a moment. The North California Islamic Council, CARE California, and the American Muslim Voice Foundation. And yeah, we want to call out to the important work that AMVE does in the interfaith arena and helping establish a Muslim voice in the community. And with that being said, also, since a large segment of our audience is Muslim, and even if you're not Muslim, I'm sure you can appreciate these words of wisdom. I wanted to share a brief verse of the Quran that sort of encapsulates our commitment to social justice. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وتعاونوا على البر والتقوى ولا تعاونوا على الإثم والعدوان واتقوا الله إن الله شديد العقاب. So in essence, Allah Azza wa Jalla is saying to us, and help one another in goodness and in piety, and do not help one another in sin and aggression, and be careful of your duty to God. Surely God is severe in punishment. So it's essentially this idea that as people of conscience, we have a sacred duty to participate in the moral struggles of our time. In this specific case, we mean Palestinian liberation from apartheid segregation and ethnic cleansing. But even more so than that, the stakes are raised when it is our own ummah, our own brothers and sisters that are the ones that are struggling. And conversely, we have a moral duty to oppose evil, and that requires more than neutrality, because neutrality is complicity. And as the verse suggests, complicity with evil is worthy of punishment. So Muslims have double the reasons to commit towards upholding Palestinian human rights and ensuring the safety of Masjid al-Aqsa. Additionally, anyone with a conscience has something at stake in Palestine's liberation. And with that being said, I'm going to introduce our wonderful speakers for today. We have Wendy Greenfield, who is the founder and co-chair of the South Bay chapter of Jewish Voice for Peace, a national grassroots organization with more than 70 chapters that works for justice and equality for Palestinians and Israelis by transforming US foreign policy. Wendy has been active on social justice issues since she was a teenager when she organized picket lines for the farm workers' Great Boycott in the 1960s. She worked with the New Jewish Agenda against the political repression and anti-Semitism of the Argentine military in the 1970s and 1980s, and organized against the initiatives to prohibit bilingual education in 1998. She taught school for 37 years, including time in Mexico and Nicaragua and everywhere. And I also wanted to introduce one of my favorite intellectual icons, Dr. Hatem Bazian, who's a teaching professor in the departments of Near Eastern and Ethnic Studies at the University of California, Berkeley. Dr. Bazian is an advisor to the Religion, Politics, and Globalization Center at UC Berkeley. In 2009, he co-founded the Islamophobia Research and Documentation Project at UC Berkeley, editor-in-chief of the Islamophobia Studies Journal, and founder and director of the International Islamophobia Studies Consortium. And I just want to say I'm a fan of the Islamophobia Studies Journal. Dr. Bazian is on the board of several organizations, including the Islamic Scholarship Fund, Muslim Legal Fund of America, and Muslim Americans for Palestine, for which he is also the founding president. And I think we're going to get started and have Wendy take it over from here.
Okay. Thank you. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay, great. So good morning. First, I'd like to thank Syed Husseini and Samina Sundas for inviting me to participate in this program. And I'd like to thank the ICNA Council for Social Justice for sponsoring it, hopefully clarifying questions that are particularly relevant at this moment in time and enabling us to form bonds of solidarity for the struggles that lie ahead. I'll add that I'm honored to be sharing the hour with Professor Hatem Bazian. Let's start with the basic definitions and dig in from there. What is Zionism? Zionism is a political ideology that says Jews need a country of their own and that the land where Palestinians have lived for centuries actually belongs to Jews. Zionism developed in 19th century Europe in response to centuries of anti-Semitism that culminated in the Holocaust. It was based on the belief that European anti-Semitism was unstoppable and that Jews needed their own country to be safe. It is summed up in the famous line, "A land without a people for a people without a land." Of course, we know that this idea was totally incorrect. The land already had a people. The failure to acknowledge and respect the existence and the rights of the Palestinian people is at the core of why Zionist settlers used force to take the land and continue to use force in present-day Palestine. Anti-Zionism is opposition to the takeover of Palestinian land and to the many forms of oppression of Palestinians by the Israeli government and society. Many Jews are among those who do not consider themselves Zionists and who strongly criticize Israel. My organization, Jewish Voice for Peace, is among them. So the next term we're going to look at is anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is discrimination against or prejudice towards Jews. Jews are either followers of Judaism, the Jewish religion, or those with a Jewish cultural background. Anti-Semitism has a long history in Europe, and strains of it are growing stronger in this country. There are a number of anti-Semitic tropes that are important to know about so that you don't use them inadvertently. During feudal times, when most people in Europe were either landowners or serfs, Jews were prohibited from owning land, basically forcing them into the roles of craftsmen, merchants, or moneylenders. That particular role became the basis for one of the most pernicious tropes about Jews, that of the rich, greedy Jew. Jews were used as scapegoats in Europe. When the peasants would rise up against the upper classes, they were told the real culprits of their terrible conditions were the Jews, diverting the righteous anger of the peasants away from the landowners who were oppressing them, and resulting in Jews being the victims of violent pogroms, mobs that would physically attack Jews and destroy their homes. During the Middle Ages, Jews were at various times expelled from England, France, Germany, Portugal, Provence, the Papal States, and Spain. The most ancient trope or stereotype about Jews is the notion that Jews were responsible for the death of Christ. Jews lived in fear around Easter because scripture would be read in churches blaming the Jews for Christ's death, which would in turn spark violent pogroms. To this day, those passages are still read aloud in many churches. A related trope was the blood libel, the idea that Jews used the blood of Christian babies in their ceremonies. We see vestiges of this trope today when modern anti-Semitic organizations make obscure and inappropriate references to child sacrifice rings and child trafficking rings. The classic anti-Semitic writing, The Protocols of the Elders of Zion, first published in Russia in 1905, purported to be the minutes of secret meetings where Jews conspired against the state with secret plans for Jews to rule the world by manipulating the economy, controlling the media, and fostering religious conflicts. It has since been published in many countries to drum up anti-Semitism. The trope of the secret manipulative cabal is a staple of such anti-Semitic organizations as QAnon. In the 1800s, many Jews in Eastern and Central Europe were integrally involved in labor and socialist movements, such as the Jewish Labor Bund. The high level of Jewish involvement in worker struggles was probably the seed of another modern anti-Semitic trope, that of Judeo-Bolshevism. Other tropes claim that Jews are not fully patriotic to the country they're living in, that they have dual loyalties. This has been particularly brought up in relation to Israel. Indeed, when former President Trump addressed the Republican Jewish coalition in 2019, he referred to Benjamin Netanyahu as your prime minister. So tropes to know and avoid: Jews are rich and greedy. Jews killed Christ. Jews use the blood of Christian children in their ceremonies. Jews are members of cabals, secret worldwide organizations that act on their own for world domination. Jews are communists. Jews have dual loyalties. They're more loyal to Israel than their own country. And to me, it's always been interesting that these tropes have both Jews as the rich and greedy owners, as well as Jews as are communists. Somehow we managed to do both jobs at once. Anyway, back to Zionism. From the beginning, Zionist leaders negotiated with imperial powers to further Jewish immigration to Palestine. Before the arrival of the British, Zionist leader, Zionist leader Theodor Herzl had assured the Sultan Abdul Hamid II in Istanbul that Zionism would benefit the Ottoman Empire, and some Zionist settlers started moving to Palestine at that time. Later, they negotiated with the British, resulting in the Balfour Declaration of 1917, which declared the intention of establishing a Jewish homeland in Palestine. It's to be noted that the word state was never mentioned, only homeland. The most shameful of Zionist negotiations with world powers is undoubtedly the negotiations with the Nazi government of Germany in 1933 to facilitate the export of German goods, which in turn enabled the emigration of Jews to Palestine. This was denounced for weakening the boycott of German goods called by many Jewish organizations around the world. In the years immediately preceding and following World War II and the Holocaust, immigration to Palestine by Jewish refugees increased. Often there was no other place for them to go. Countries around the world, including the United States, refused to accept them. The Zionist ideology that won out in Palestine was that of a state for Jews, not a homeland which they shared with others. While one can have deep sympathy for the Jewish refugees who arrived in Palestine in the World War II era, nothing can excuse the hyper-nationalism that then led them to drive off and engage in massacres of the native population. In 1948, with arms and training from the British, Zionist militias drove off Palestinians off their native soil, resulting in the terrible tragedy that is known as the Nakba. So back to anti-Zionism. In the early 1800s and early 1900s, most American Jews had a disparaging or dismissive view of Zionism. While the Jewish left critiqued Zionism for its nationalism that ran counter to the interests of the international working class, others saw it as counter to the assimilation of Jews as full citizens to whatever country they lived in. By the 1930s, Jewish leftists critiqued the alignment of Zionists with British imperialism against the indigenous Palestinian community. And there have always been several currents within Zionism. From its start, some have believed in the dream of a liberal Israel or Zionism that guaranteed equal rights for all who lived there, as promised in the Declaration of Independence. Liberal Zionists want to support efforts for equal rights for Palestinians and a stop to expansionism, while concurrently upholding the dream of a Jewish state. They are strong proponents of the two-state solution. There's a growing number of Jews in the US and around the world, including a minority in Israel, who no longer believe in liberal Zionism, recognizing that Zionism has always been expansionist and always prioritized settling Jews at the expense of native Palestinians. One interesting trend is that some proponents of liberal Zionism, including J Street, have become stronger in their criticisms of Israeli policies. They are one of 6 Jewish organizations that have signed on to the McCollum Bill, HR 2590, protecting the human rights of Palestinian children and families, which would require the annual certification that no US military aid dollars sent to Israel are used for the military detention of Palestinian children, the demolition of Palestinian homes, or to further Israeli expansionism. Of the 6, Jewish Voice for Peace is the only organization that specifically calls itself an anti-Zionist organization. 4 of the others would probably be called liberal Zionist organizations. On its website, If Not Now, said it is building a movement of Jews to end Israel's occupation and transform the American Jewish community. a call for justice that does not use the term anti-Zionist. Should we then consider them non-Zionist? It's interesting to deal with that term in all its nuances. Today, the most pro-Zionist organizations are funded by a combination of the Israeli government and private US foundations and individuals. The World Zionist Organization is committed to promoting the ideology of Zionism. Birthright USA trips are free trips for Jewish American teenagers to Israel to encourage a bond between Jews in the diaspora and Israel. Similar organizations pay for tours of Israel by US elected officials. The Jewish United Fund uses its tax-deductible donations to acquire Palestinian land, including about 16,000 acres of land in the West Bank for settlements. It's important to note that you don't have to be Jewish to be a Zionist. In fact, you don't have to like Jews to be a Zionist. 2 years after the Balfour Declaration, Lord Balfour declared that Zionism would, quote, mitigate the age-long miseries created for Western civilization by the presence in its midst of a body, the Jews, which too long has been alien and even hostile. Among today's more prominent anti-Semitic Zionists is Pastor John Hagee, who heads CUFI, the Christians United for Israel. He once said that Hitler and the 6 million dead Jews were God's instrument to facilitate other Jews moving to Israel. He's also extremely Islamophobic, saying Islamics hate us because it's their religious duty to hate us. The International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, IHRA, working definition of anti-Semitism, seeks to provide a definition and examples of what constitutes anti-Semitism. While the definition is pretty straightforward, 6 of the 11 examples they cite have to do with types of speech used to criticize Israel, such as denying Jews the right to self-determination or applying a double standard to Israel that isn't applied to other countries. This definition is a real danger to speech critical of Israel. The US is among the 36 countries that have adopted it. There are many struggles around in state legislatures and colleges around the country. Here in the South Bay, the student government rejected it at De Anza College. It was passed earlier in the year at Foothill College. But anti-Zionist student leaders hope to see a reversal of that since the student government adopted a pro-Palestinian resolution. The University of Santa Clara has also rejected the IHRA definition. It's important to recognize that the overwhelming majority of anti-Semitism in the US today comes from the extreme right. The white supremacist organizations, including such organizations as the Ku Klux Klan, neo-Nazis, Aryan Nations, Oath Keepers, QAnon, and more. All of these organizations are also racist and Islamophobic. So back to the original question, is anti-Zionism anti-Semitic? I'd give a resounding no to that question. Anti-Zionism, rejecting Israeli expansionism and ethnocentrism in Israel and the occupied territories, is a principled stand for justice. All people of conscience who care about justice for people everywhere can and should claim a stance of anti-Zionism. The question is how to do that in an effective manner. One consideration is to be conscious that Zionism means many things to many people. While JVP and a growing segment of the population call themselves anti-Zionist, recognizing the tremendous harm it's caused Palestinians since its inception, a member of J Street, or even if not now, may consider themselves liberal Zionists. If you say you're anti-Zionist, it's best to define how you mean the term. Be strong, principled, and clear. Know that you can stand firmly against Israeli apartheid, brutality, and expansionism simply by using those terms, as If Not Now does. Depending on the audience, that may be the most effective path. Be conscious of not using anti-Semitic tropes when criticizing Zionism or Israel. While there's no doubt that pro-Zionist lobbies give a lot of political donations, elected representatives also support Israel because they themselves believe in some kind of Zionism, or because many of their constituents do. The idea that Zionists manipulate Congress with their money touches on the old Semitic trope of Jews and money and Jews manipulating world events. Many pro-Zionist Jewish organizations promote the idea that any criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic. Even Jews can be called self-hating Jews, myself included. I've had that experience. realize that sometimes we'll be attacked for strong criticism of Israel, no matter how careful we are in the terms we use. Ultimately, the best way to defeat anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, anti-Arab prejudice, and indeed any type of prejudice against any group of people is to work together in solidarity for justice. As the De Anza College Student Senate considered a resolution of solidarity with Palestinians yesterday, many speakers identified themselves as Jewish. As a vocal member of a Jewish anti-Zionist organization, I feel I'm strengthening support among the US population for the Palestinian cause by showing that this stance is not anti-Semitic. And at the same time, I'm lessening anti-Semitism because I can make it clear that not all Jews support Israel's cruel policies. It's important on many levels that we build relationships and get to know and trust each other. And it's important for those outside our communities to see us working together, to know that it doesn't mean you're anti-Jewish if you're anti-Zionist. It means you're pro-justice. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Wendy, for clarifying all of that. Yeah, it's really important for us to define what anti-Semitism is, what anti-Zionism is, and to differentiate between the two, and to also recognize the long history of Jewish organizing work towards social justice. You know, I was really intrigued by this idea of both the racist myth of Jews as the anti-Semitic trope of Jews being greedy moneylenders and also communists. It was like Schrodinger's racist myth. Yeah, really surprising. And with that being said, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Hatem Bazian.
Thank you, and assalamu alaikum. First, let me thank Wendy for really an impeccable presentation that given us the context of both dealing with anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. And if I want to present or put my context to build on some of the key issues, I think we're possibly going to mirror our presentation, which is actually very positive. One is for us to think that anti-Semitism has a much longer history and array in both Western thought or Eurocentric thought. And I would say that the relationship between the Jewish community and the Muslim community also was really a relationship of solidarity for quite a long period of time. Rather than often we pick the question of relations in the 20th century, I think people need to go back to the 1492, which is the Inquisition and the expulsion of both Muslims and Jews. So when we think of the history of Muslims and Jews in Andalusia or in the Mediterranean or in North Africa, in Yemen, in Iraq, and many of the other areas in the Muslim world, what we find is actually there were a co-participation in both solidarity, scholarship, and engagement in the society. I recommend for people the book When Asia Was the World, which looks at the pre-modern world that actually examines and look at the relationship, trade relationship, networks of movement of scholarship across the vast territory from India all the way up to North Africa and Spain. And I think it's very important to locate when we speak about anti-Semitism and Muslim-Jewish relationship that we don't fall into the trap of thinking of those relationships through Eurocentric lens, which is very important because I work on the question both of Palestine and decolonial thought, that many of us approach the world through the Eurocentric definition of the world. So that's one important piece, that to trace back to an earlier history and to navigate that history in distinctive separation and in a different trajectory than examine it through Eurocentricity. Second, the adoption or the emergence of Zionism, as Wendy have mentioned, in the 19th century, it comes out of European experience, first and foremost, both Jewish experience in Europe with the anti-Semitism, with the pogroms, But more critically, which is something that is we often erase, is that the Europeans wanted actually the Jews out of Europe. Even when Napoleon arrived in Egypt in 1897, he actually was trying to appeal to Eastern Jews to reconstitute them in Palestine. And then we get into the British, even prior to the Balfour Declaration, as early as the 1850s to 1865 period, the British began a whole project of archaeological diggings in Palestine in order to authenticate the biblical narrative. Within that idea is the reconstituting of the Jews into Palestine. Now, the important question is why in here Napoleon and then the British introduced these ideas of reconstituting the Jews into Palestine, knowing that this is after the French Revolution, after the European Enlightenment. I still think that they turned the light off, but that's my own perspective on it. After the Reformation and the enfranchisement in Europe, why is it that there is still this notion of reconstituting the Jews in Europe? And that gets us into Christian theology, speculative theology, which at the heart of John Hagee's distorted worldview. In that distorted theological worldview, that Armageddon and the second coming of Jesus passed it through the reconstituting of the Jews in Palestine, in the state of Israel. And once that happens, then Armageddon takes place and then Jesus will arrive. So that is the speculative theology that is at the core of the evangelical Christian right. But I don't want to limit it to the evangelical Christian right, because Britain is not evangelical. At the time that they were introducing this was mainstream theological perspectives that were advocated by the Anglican Church in the UK. And the Queen actually funded that expedition, archaeological expedition. So archaeology was put on the service of what I consider to be European anti-Semitism that is wedded to a theologically distorted notion of what history needs to unfold in order for centering Eurocentric thought in relations to Palestine and the world. So we need to actually date it a little bit earlier than the Balfour Declaration. Now, the fact that Herzl, which is the third point, appealed to different powers, one, he was looking at the endemic nature of anti-Semitism in Europe, and that's correct. Again, Herzl was looking at, especially the Dreyfus affair in France, was very important because he covered the trial as a reporter in Vienna for the press, and therefore he was impacted. But if you look at European discourses at the time, there were heavy anti-Semitism, and Europe, rather than confronting anti-Semitism, actually adopted the removal, the transfer out of the Jewish population by adopting the Zionist project. So Herzl was appealing. He visited Tsarist Russia. He visited the Sultan Abdul Hamid, and they're actually both in Herzl diaries. He writes about the visit to Istanbul to try to meet and make an offer to Sultan Abdul Hamid, and Abdul Hamid rebuffs him. Then the meetings that begins with the British. So was an attempt to try to find a solution, right, to quote the Jewish question. So the Jewish question is a racist question in Europe, which continues to be with us till today, right, in terms of that the Jewish person does not belong. And therefore, they have to have policies to deal with the Jewish person, the Jewish questions. I compared the Jewish question to the Muslim question today in Europe. Actually, the same topography going back to 1492 is still present today in European discourse. So Herzl adopts the colonial project. So when he wrote to Cecil Rice, he said, why do I turn to you? Because it's something colonial. So Zionism was recruited as a junior partner in British colonial enterprise, and Herzl and the British at least struck and found a common goal or a common theme in the colonization of Palestine. Again, point 4. The British, in adopting Zionism, it is not because they loved the Jews and hated Muslims. From the British point of view, they hated both. Right? The British were approaching it from their own strategic interest. We often say that the possibility of speaking from 2 sides of your mouth, the British actually speaks from 4 sides of their mouth, and there have maybe 2 other sides that are in the museum as well. Right? So the British were thinking, and this whole concept of the Middle East, as in my class, the British were thinking of how to protect India, because India was the primary prize of the crown. India was provided the richest returns for the British Empire. The British took out of India $15 trillion or $15 trillion in value. All of India's trade for the British passed through the Indian Ocean to the Red Sea, and then through the Suez Canal when the Suez Canal was opened. And the British began colonize Egypt in 1882. So the discussion in the British, again, we have the minutes of the ministerial meetings taking place in England during the period of the Balfour Declaration, before the Balfour Declaration, and what to do. India had mountainous protection in the north, meaning protecting India's from invasion from the Russian, as well as possible maybe an intervention from the north, while Egypt did not. And therefore, if the trade passes through the Suez Canal, we need to find a way to secure it. So that is the idea of a buffer state, that for the British, where you could actually strike 2 birds with 1 stone. Right? So the British were thinking strategically relative to trade, and we already know 2 months ago when the ship ran aground in the Suez Canal, 12 to 14% of global trade passes through the Suez Canal. It was much more during the British period in there. So the British were motivated from a strategic consideration for their trade, for their empire, and utilized in here the Zionists as a utilitarian tool for their implementation. And the second part of this, which I think for us in the Muslim world and those who have Islamic history, also struck a deal with the Sharif Hussein of Mecca to what came to be known as the Great Arab Revolt, which I say it was not great, nor was it Arab. It was T.E. Lawrence, that was an intelligence officer from the British operating out of Cairo. And similarly, the British promised Sharif Hussein that they will give him a state over all the whole region. And they actually said that we will appoint you as a caliph. So for those who visit London, maybe we should knock on the door of the parliament and the queen and ask her, we need an appointment for the caliph, because you actually promised this, because they're constantly saying that the Muslims want the caliph and we need to oppose it. You actually, in the McMahon Hussein correspondence, the British promised Hussein that he will be made into a caliph. So the period of the early period of the World War I and the subsequent period, it was a colonial discourse that was at the core to protect British interests and utilizing the Arab Muslim part and the Jewish Zionist part to facilitate British imperial discourse. If we forget this, then we begin to, again, internalize anti-Semitic discourses. So Zionism is a settler colonial project that came as a junior partner under the British protection, in partnership with some of the Arab Muslim leaders that also partnered with the British during that same period. So that's very, very critical for us to understand this, because prior to the 20th century, Muslim-Jewish relations were not colored or distorted by means of Western anti-Semitism, meaning that blaming the Jews for all of these elements that Wendy specifically mentioned, rightly so, that this becomes be imported into the Arab and Muslim world, and the discourses that often are engaged in the Arab and Muslim world is always blaming the Jewish person or an articulation of the Jewish person, rather than actually looking at Eurocentricity. Colonization was not a Jewish enterprise. Colonization was a European enterprise. The British, the French, the Dutch, the Belgian, the Spanish, the Portuguese, right? The Germans, all these. But when you introduce the Jewish person and use distorted theology, you begin to actually almost completely erase the historical responsibilities that are there. Now, I'm going to add another dimension to our conversations building on this. If we are discussing Zionism as a settler colonial project, then we need to look at settler colonial project and what settler colonial projects are about. It does include a racialization of the indigenous population. It does engage genocide and transfer, which again, is not unique, it's actually normative. It does engage in globalization or a global dimension that has capital, that has militarism, that has all types of innovations that are there. It either engages in enslavement, indentured labor, or captive labor to work in the settler colonies. And again, French and British, but also in relation to Palestinians today, they actually are used as a form of cheap labor. So even if you go to the settlements, many of the settlements are built by Palestinian labor because of the circumstances that are put. So that's normative in order. And then using religious discourse, so manifest destiny relative to Western Christian mission. And I would say that Zionism is using a form of manifest destiny, that God gave us this, and therefore utilizing religious discourse, even though that in Jewish thought, that is not the way how Palestine or even returning to Jerusalem as a site of holiness, it is articulated within the Jewish text. So we need to understand it that as part of colonial discourses that needs to be understood. The last point I want to make so we could have question and answer. I know that many who try to advocate for Palestine often get into what I consider to be both a complete horrendous discourse by trying to negate the impact and what happened in the Holocaust. Right? They begin into a way to say, well, you know, either to say the Holocaust did not exist or the so-called Holocaust. They begin to engage in a discourse that is so, for me, is so destructive, and it does not have anything to do with advocating for Palestine. One is that if you just read Hitler's discourse, Hitler's discourse is equal opportunity. There's only one superior race, and everyone else is to be what you call rejected. So the fact that you are asserting a particular notions, and I know some people say, well, Hitler did not finish the job. All these are so horrendous because you completely are misunderstanding what the Third Reich and what Nazi Germany was all about. Is the superiority, it's white supremacy on steroids, and really using the final solution, meaning eliminating all those lesser population, both theologically as well racially. So it's a biological racism having its what you call natural consequences, which you eliminate all, quote, the lesser races. So that's one. Second is that the evidence is so overwhelming in relations to what took place in the Holocaust, that to stand up and to think that you're defending Palestine by denying the Holocaust or trying to diminish the debate, it does not actually do anything other than diminish your own argument overall. Right? And I know some people begin to actually engage in what I consider to be logical Olympics, if there is such thing, trying to say, well, it's not 6 million, it's 4.5, it's 3 or 5. That is just, you know, there's something called compounded ignorance. This is, for me, is compounded ignorance. One person dying is significant enough for you to make an argument between 6 to 4 or 5 million, and you think that you're contributing to the debate. It's completely what you call compounded ignorance in this sense. The last point I want to make about the issue of the Holocaust and how people engage in it. It is really asserting that you're trying to deny the pain of a people in order to assert the pain of the Palestinians. You don't actually need to do this. That is not how, it's not what you call a pain Olympics. One can still affirm the pain and the suffering of the Jewish community and people, both in relations to the Holocaust and post-Holocaust, without having to let go of actually expressing the pain and the suffering of the Palestinians. Both are not mutually exclusive, right? So as an understanding that, and for me, the Holocaust is basically is European history. That is European history. It is from 1492. Why do we understand the expulsion and the removal of Muslims and Jews from Spain? We understand the continued pogroms. We understand the colonization. We understand the genocide of the indigenous population. We understand the slavery. And then we actually break in relations to understanding how the Holocaust is actually part of normative European history, if anything, concluding with this massive destruction visited upon the Jewish population. And then Muslims in Europe actually express solidarity. If you think about the Albania, the only country in Europe where the percentage of Jews in Albania before World War II, post-World War II increased, because Jews actually sought refuge in Albania. The king of Morocco, when the Germans asked him that the Jews in Morocco should wear the star, he refused. He said, no, these are my subjects. They will not be treated as such. You will have the narrative of the Imam of the mosque in Paris, the Imam Bagdir, who actually saved the Jews by giving them certificates that they're Muslims, and hid Jews in the mosque. More importantly, one of the most famous singers in France at the time, his name is Hillel, came to the Germans were actually wanting to arrest him, to send him to the concentration camps. He came to the Imam and asked for a certificate, and the Imam bin Ghadir gave him a certificate. And not only that, he sent the assistant of the mosque to the cemetery, the Muslim cemetery, to change one of the headstones and write the father of Halil on there. So if the German arrests him, he say, no, I'm a Muslim and my father is buried in there. And sure enough, the German arrested him, right? And when they arrested him, he said, no, I'm a Muslim and my father is buried there. So they went and saw the headstone, so they let him go. And Halil lived until 1975, and every time he performed, he actually said that I was saved by the Muslims in the Grand Mosque in France. So don't what you call miskuru and think that you're helping the Palestinians by engaging in the denial, which actually comes out of white supremacy, KKK type of discourse, because often some people share what you call these memes or these sites to try to assert, look, this is, it did not happen, or it's exaggerated. All these have to be understood. You're actually damaging rather than helping. So denying the pain of a people does not help by trying to assert the pain of the people. The last part of it, there are some arguments that are Jewish arguments or discussions. So I think it is something that within the Jewish community, a debate about the utilization of the Holocaust in arguments of Israel, I think that's a discussion for the Jewish community to have among themselves, whether Jewish Voice of Peace or others. But for us to enter into that discussions, we're entering into sometimes a conversation that we are not really both having the moral and ethical ground to do it, because again, this is within the community, that's a discussion that they have had. So there are some times where you actually, as a Palestinian, as a pro-Palestinian, as a Muslim, as an Arab, that this conversation, you say that you don't, in Arabic, we say, la mahalla laka min al-i'rab, that you don't have a position in the sentence, right? This is using Arabic grammar as a way to explain it. So sometimes you actually have to actually practice that this is a conversation that belongs to the Jewish community to have in order to arrive at the discussion of such an important issue, because you are going into often a slippery slope in those areas. So Jazakumullah khair for listening to me, and look forward to having your questions.
Well, yeah, inshallah. Thank you both of our speakers for enlightening us today. I see there's some comments of welcome and expressing that that Wendy is here with us today. Also, thank you, Dr. Hatem. I just wanted to say, yeah, thank you for giving voice to a lot of the, for example, thank you for denouncing and recognizing how silly it is that, as you mentioned, there is no oppression Olympics. Belittling the suffering of another people does not draw more positive attention to our own. And that, there's a zero net gain in doing so. And that also, that we have a long history of shared experience and connections with the Jewish diaspora, and then that I feel have been hindered by the presence of a settler colonial ideology of Zionism, which, as you highlighted, was originally a European enterprise that was just sort of connected to Judaism more recently. But we also have to highlight that history of longstanding European colonization and white supremacy that sort of inspired Zionism. And let's see. Oh, Jazakallah khair. I got a comment from the community recognizing my moderating skills, so that's cool.
Great.
Seems that we have a brother, Aman Ayaz. I was going to say, brother, if you could actually put your question in the. Actually, you know what? You can go ahead and speak and offer your question. We're going to do Q&A. So yeah, brother Aman, if you want to ask your question, go ahead.
Jazakallah khair. Assalamu alaikum. Question to Wendy. Definitely, it was a very good explanation of the history, and I enjoyed your perspective of the entire history that took place. But I still have this question: how can a Jewish person be anti-Semitic when the person is Zionist? Like, for example,
Zionist.
Yes. So I still don't understand this part, because it is like, it doesn't make any sense to me. Like, it did not make any sense to me in the past. It doesn't make sense to me right now as well. I still don't have that background to justify that. Like, how can Israel or anybody else or any organization call them anti-Semitic? I don't understand. Like, it doesn't make any logical sense to me.
That is because it doesn't make any sense. It's basically something that is used to insult and to quiet people from speaking out. They call us self-hating Jews, which on one level is it is true that oppressed minorities can sometimes internalize the greater society's stereotypes and look down on themselves on some level. And I think that in some level is linked to that we're self-hating Jews. But basically I think the stronger link is that they cannot conceive of anybody who doesn't support Israel as truly uplifting Judaism and Jews. And it's just beyond them. And I can remember distinctly being at the state capitol in Sacramento, lobbying to support the right to boycott Israel when that law was in effect. And we had just spoken with one of the state assembly members' chief of staff, and he came out into the lobby and saw us and just said, "Bunch of anti-Semites." And I'm like, last thing I would expect to hear about myself, certainly, but it's just this strict line. If you're against Israel, you're an anti-Semite. In certain people's view of the world.
Thank you, Wendy, for commenting on how silly it is to accuse Semites, both Jewish and Palestinian, and their supporters of anti-Semitism for simply advocating for the rights of Palestinians. Mm-hmm. We have another question, and I believe, Dr. Hatem Bazian, you discussed earlier Christian Zionism, and you discussed how there's a sort of a distortion of an understanding of the Bible and a prophecy. So the question that we're getting from the audience here is that in reference to Jewish sacred texts, can you shed light on basically what is said in in Jewish texts and how that is distorted to justify, settler colonial Zionism?
Yeah, well, let me say first, I am not a specialist on the Jewish text. I'm a specialist on Islamic text. So my reference would be based on my reading of some of the anti-Zionist literature. That in particular, Orthodox Judaism, which is up to actually 1945, just even before the conclusion of Second World War, was the dominant perspective in relations to the Jewish population returning to Palestine, right? There is a prohibition of coming to the sacred, coming to the holy without the Messiah coming. And when the Messiah comes, he calls people to return and reconstituting the Jewish community. At least that's like the simplest way to understand it. And there are still segments of the Orthodox Jewish community that still hold onto this perspective, which means it is the religious text and adherence to it that should be the way of how we constitute the Jews back in Palestine with the Messiah, rather than, which is the critique, modernity, power, the sword. Actually, the Zionists in the, especially Jabotinsky and others, it says that not by means of the book Zion will rise, but rather Zion will rise by means of the sword. And that distinctively, it is an late 19th century, early 20th century shift within Jewish thought in relations to modernity, embracing nationalism, embracing Eurocentric thought, and also embracing a particular form of European Reformation. So that's, again, it's an impact. I would also make a comparison because also the Muslims went through the same thing, which basically adopting modernity, adopting nationalism, adopting Eurocentricity on how to craft a society. And I would say that we're all almost right now acting and engaging in the world through the replication of the universal normativity of Eurocentricity. That's a very big word, but in essence, we're all attempting to live in the world imitating European construct because of our experiences and I would say unfolding multiple ways of erasure. And one of the most fundamental way of erasure is erasing the way of knowing the world, right? Which is, if the way of the world, knowing the world, is no longer you are actually doing it through your own eyes, but rather through a lens. And that lens right now, we all are wearing Ray-Ban sunglasses. These are Eurocentricity. So we look at the world in that way, right? And as such, that's what impacts and how we see the world through Eurocentric side. I recommend for people to read W.D. Du Bois on double consciousness. That's very important because, again, it's how is it that you look at yourself through the gaze of the other, and you're no longer actually seeing yourself and engaging in the world through your own independent eyes. So that's how I at least look at what we're dealing with.
Well, thank you, Dr. Hatem Bazian. Thank you for highlighting that theological shift, from the text to the sword. And also, or I shouldn't say maybe a theological to sort of a secular colonial perspective. And then also I was going to say, thank you also for highlighting, that's another thing that we don't typically discuss, that our global system, the nation states, political liberalism, economic liberalism, these are products of a specific historic and geographical context that we're sort of, these are hegemonic ideas that were kind of like forced upon the world. And sometimes we have to like get out of that thinking, get out of that Eurocentric thinking. And
what's dangerous of it is that we put what you call a veneer, an umbrella of religious text on it.
Yeah.
So we begin again, manifest destiny, a religious text on it. Success theology, that God wants you to be capitalist, a religious theology on it. That, power, and that God wants you to be powerful. So we become what you call, we put on military industrial complex a veneer of religious text on it. In terms of prison and punishment, that, the 10 Commandments, right? So we begin to use religious text to authorize the prison industrial complex, which is a source of income and an investment tool. All these are tropes that use religious texts as a way to rationalize all these different types of what I consider to be oppressive structures.
Subhanallah, may we never betray the sunnah of our prophet and the ways of our ancestors for the dominant paradigms of today. So I have another question. So this question is, how do we find out which Muslim organizations participate in CVE and or partner with Zionist organizations? So I think this is a great, it's great that the person asking the question is sort of like seeing the connection between the struggle for Palestine and other social justice issues, such as, Islamophobia or anti-Muslim racism and surveillance on Muslim communities. And I think I would add, maybe another good question is, how do we hold these institutions accountable? How do we steer them in the right direction?
So is that a question for me or to Wendy or both of us?
So both these questions can be addressed by anyone. So Wendy, if you want to jump in on any of these, please feel free. So
I'm going to pass on that one because I don't feel.
No worries.
Well, okay. So first, let me take the question of CVE. For those who don't know, this is what you call junk science, making into policy, countering violent extremism. This post 9/11, even during the Obama administration, that there are some way to counter violent extremism, but using what I consider to be identity markers and interventions in the normative practices of the Muslim community, and using the community institutional capacity to essentially spy on itself and become what you call a conduit for Muslims as a class to be seen and targeted as a suspect class. So in essence, CVE makes Muslims as citizens on probation. So your imam and your religious institutions are rolled into CVE. Your mental health providers are rolled into CVE. Let me say that all of the theories about this counter-violent extremism is actually within the scope of junk science. And it's actually, I'm apologizing to science for using them in describing them, because they should not be in this. So CVE funneled money into some Muslim institutions in order to engage in self-reporting, as well as trying to say that we are experts on how to prevent Muslims from being violent and engaged in extremism. So that's very, very important for us to refuse to be treated as a class that we're a suspect class, even though that the US own study says that the primary domestic violent extremist threat comes from white supremacist groups and white nationalists. Yet all of the CVE funding and all of the apparatus was directed at Muslims. And I know that CARE has filed a lawsuit against the federal government in relations to sending FBI agents to the mosques to create entrapment, to agitate and get some of the youth engaged in both rhetoric and so on. So there's entrapment cases, material support. So again, CVE as such, you could find out by actually going to both Department of Justice and the FBI program. These are public programs, publicly funded program, and you could actually seek the information. And you also could take a look at Muslim organization by looking at their 990 reports to see where their funding is coming from. And I think it's important for us to challenge. I know there are a number of organizations that received CVE, and they actually accept the framing of good Muslim, bad Muslim type of dynamics, which is, again, should be rejected out of hand. The Muslims are a diverse bunch, cover the full spectrum, right? Both theologically, politically, culturally, racially, and also in between. So we need to almost insist on that. As far as the whole normalization pattern, and I think this is something maybe we could speak, and maybe Wendy can also speak about the partnership with Jewish organizations that are committed to empowering both the Muslim and Jewish community together in confronting anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, as well as confronting Israeli oppression of the Palestinians. versus many of these what you call interfaith washing, which basically use interfaith settings to silence discussions and silence debate, and use the text. Let's study text together, but it's the text is becoming to silence what is taking place in general. So we need to be very clear. I'm very critical of the MLI program, Muslim Leadership Initiative. I'm very critical of the ISNA partnership with AJC under the MJAC. I'm very critical of a Muslim Leadership Initiative that is run by Shalom Hartman. All these are intended to amplify and center Zionism and Israel relations as a way of bringing the Muslim partner on the principle of silencing the Palestinian narrative and the Palestinian question. So we need to be very clear in this. At least from my perspective, the AJC is not a candidate to partnership for anything, because they have been the primary purveyor and centering Islamophobia in their discourse in terms of David Harris and his many spots on the radio, and never misses an opportunity to actually be Islamophobic, targeting Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, Keith Ellison, giving the Courage Award to Ayaan Hirsi Ali, promoting and amplifying the books of Stephen Emerson. So this is the AJC, and they're coming and partnering with the Muslim community to counter Islamophobia. It's like, unless I have what you call a mental lobotomy, I wouldn't think that the AJC is the partner. There are many other, Jewish Voice for Peace has been solid on Islamophobia. They did a complete report on it and have been engaged in it from the get-go in relations to understanding Islamophobia and anti-Semitism. So at least you need to know who are partners that are committed both to challenging as well as the empowerment collectively to alter what is taking place at present.
All right, awesome. Thank you so much for your response. And then hopefully in the future discussions, we can talk more about concrete actions to hold these institutions accountable and hopefully sway them away from this illogical associations with some of these problematic groups. It's interesting that Ayaan Hirsi Ali, I think, ran for office, I believe in the Netherlands, but I know she ran an office in Europe, and her entire platform was xenophobia and hating on immigrants. I think she had to withdraw from the race because her chief lie was that she was basically saying that immigrants lie for the reasons that they came here. And it was funny because she was caught lying on the reason she immigrated to Europe. So it was one of the best incidents of karma that I've ever witnessed. So
she was in the parliament. She was in parliament. The Dutch government withdrew her citizenship because she lied. And long and behold, she was recruited at the American Enterprise Institute, and now she pontificates across the country about what is Islam and Muslims. She actually, on CNN, she says she recommends to Muslims to convert to Christianity. Can you imagine anyone actually with a straight face telling 1.8 billion Muslims that their salvation is by actually converting to Christianity and being taken as representative of the Muslim community? For me, that's like compounded, again, insult. One is that she already said that she's not Muslim because she said she abandoned Islam. Again, it's a free country. But for CNN to put her in there to speak on behalf of Muslims, the other, they brought in Irshad Manji. So you have both Ayaan Hirsi Ali and Irshad Manji speaking for the Muslim community in the United States. And what's his name? Anderson Cooper says, I could sit there and talk with you for hours. Yeah, because they're giving you what you call Islamophobia on a plate, and you're just devouring it and think that you're sophisticated.
I would like to say that I had a wonderful partner with a local Muslim community leader. And during that campaign of the state of California to pass the law that said that no entity should enter into a contract with the state of California who were involved with BDS, right? Mm-hmm. And so we visited many representatives' offices together, and it was like a fearsome duo. And I think that the representatives were impressed by the fact that we were there together and supporting each other. And I really think that it's important to have that kind of partnership to break stereotypes on many people's lenses, and to show that, it really isn't that you're just for Jews or just for Palestinians or just for, but that you really are for justice and that you support the right of people to live in dignity in their own land and be treated with respect.
Thank you for voicing that, Wendy. And just so people know that if they're looking for interfaith partners, there is no interfaith partner better, in my personal opinion, than organizations like Jewish Voice for Peace, than people like Wendy who want to do work with us, but at the same time recognize the dignity and are willing to uphold our human rights and willing to fight for our community. So this is the type of brotherhood and sisterhood that we should strive for with interfaith partnerships. And so the next question is, I believe this is in reference to Palestine, but essentially I'd like to hear from both of you. What is the ideal situation? And what would decolonizing, what would the fall of Israeli apartheid, what is the ideal situation that we envision where we can have this beautiful coexistence?
Well, I can certainly, I don't know what the ideal would be. I given the fact that so many people have had so many losses, loss of life, loss of their homes, loss of land, I don't know if we can create an ideal. And as an American Jewish organization, Jewish Voice for Peace has really kind of stepped back from that and said it is up to the people in that land to formulate whether, a final solution is a one-state solution or two-state solution or whatever. I mean, to me personally, I don't know how two-state solution would be enacted at this point, because there are so many Jewish settlements in the West Bank and so on, that I don't know how you would formulate any kind of viable two-state solution. But it may be possible if there's enough force to say those settlements just have to be evacuated. That's it, But it really is going to take, before any kind of, obviously what we want to avoid at all costs is to have a one-state solution that's an apartheid one-state solution, which is pretty much what it is at this point in time. So any kind of two-state solution you could say might be a step better than that, but is it really the step that will fix things for people as much as possible at this point? And we've just kind of said what we want to do is take away American dollars or restrict how they're being used so that we're not enabling the Israeli government to continue in its present course, and that will allow a more even balance of power so that there can be some real negotiations to get to a better solution. But aside from that, I don't feel like I'm the right person to say this is the ideal that will bring us forward.
Yeah. I will actually, in my book, I looked at the 6 frames of how people look at how to solve or address the issue of Palestine. Again, my book is Palestine is Something Colonial. But, and more importantly, I think the question that is posed, it is the wrong question for us to have and delve in from a solidarity perspective. I've been active during the anti-apartheid movement for South Africa. We always defer to the ANC to determine what is their view of how to address and resolve the issues pertaining to their struggle in their circumstances. A similar point we took relative to the Central American solidarity period, whether it's El Salvador, Nicaragua, and so on, which means that we need to understand our location in what does it mean to be in solidarity with the Palestinians. And I think the Palestinians are asking you specifically for the following. They're asking you to commit yourself to supporting the BDS movement, the boycott, divestment, and sanction movement. And that is set up in relations to international law. Again, that Palestinians have their rights guaranteed, that they have the right of return, that they are not subject to an apartheid system. How that manifests for us is to go into what I call the weeds, to try to identify. That is not our role. Our role is, again, to respond to the solidarity call of the Palestinians, the boycott, divestment, and sanction movement. And what does that mean in relations to Palestine. The second, which is very, very critical, what the Palestinians are asking, if you are in the United States, we need to understand that it is the United States that is empowering Israel for the United States foreign policy objectives. Again, I would say that the United States as a country pursues its interests. Its interest is in oil, its interest in maintaining and dominating markets and access and being a superpower in the region. And Israel provides a utilitarian function, like United Arab Emirates provide a utilitarian function, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and so on. So we need to understand our role in here is to try to impact the funding that is coming from the United States toward Israel, and to be very critical and stop, because that's my tax money. But I also am an equal opportunity. I'm very critical of the Arab countries. So I also don't want foreign aid to go to Egypt and the other countries, because all this foreign aid is going toward the military. And all of these militaries are used domestically to oppress the population. Because I know some people say, oh, you're only what you call critiquing Israel. I said, no, I'm an equal opportunity critic. So again, I welcome for you to join me in calling for cutting foreign aid, because our foreign aid has been actually utilized to counter to the best interest of people, does not uphold human rights, and actually is often funding and funneling money to military powers, dictatorship, and so on. So I want people to know that this is what you're being asked here in solidarity with the Palestinians. And don't get yourself twisted around a tree trying to find what is the how to solve the Palestine crisis by trying to find your own articulated, what you call, solution to the problem. So those are what the Palestinians are asking.
Thank you to both of you for your responses. Thank you for recognizing, both of you sort of contributed to this understanding that we have a limited role. It's not necessarily our position to dictate on Palestinians how they should, respond to their situation. Ours is more of a role of solidarity. And as you both, pointed out, that our role is to amplify the voice of the oppressed and to support BDS, boycott, divest, and sanctions, the global, international, non-violent boycott, divestment, and sanction response to Israel's crimes against humanity.
Can I ask for two things from our audience? One, if you could fill the survey on Islamophobia. I put it in the chat for everyone. We're really needing data and how the Muslim community is impacted by Islamophobia. So please fill the survey and also see if you could share it on your social media to the Muslim community. And the second, I'm going to share my screen for just 1 second, is that if you are able to download the Islamophobia reporting app, this is an app to report Islamophobic incidents. Data is very critical. Report Islamophobia, and we're engaged in partnership with many Muslim organizations, including CARE and others. So data is very important for us to get a sense of the crisis that we're facing. So it's available both on iPhone and Android. So data is very critical. So please fill the survey and also download the app and use it if you can. Thank you.
Thank you. So we're actually getting bombarded with a lot of good questions. I'm going to try to filter out some of the questions, some of the more pertinent questions. One of them was essentially asking, so now that we've covered the anti-Semitic tropes that pro-Palestinian activists should, have a moral obligation to avoid, but now that we've gotten past that, is there a deliberate attempt to conflate justified Palestinian anger and anger of their allies at complicit institutions, at people who are in the same way, there might have been people who were complicit with white supremacist racial apartheid in the United States. Is there an attempt to sort of conflate anti-Semitism with that justified anger? Yeah, so if or even any expression of opposition towards the state of Israel. So if y'all want to Wendy, if you would like to go first, then we can have Dr. Hatem.
Well, I certainly think that that is the go-to response, is that people make criticisms of Israel, and Israel's strongest responders will just say, you're saying this because you're anti-Semitic. And so they're very, very protective of Israel and do use that as a shield. And it is a problem that we have to get through. And that's one of the reasons, besides that we don't want to support anti-Semitism, but another reason to avoid anti-Semitic tropes is so that it can't be somehow twisted and used to invalidate your criticism or your solidarity. It's really important to do it in a careful and principled way, and to do it in a way that focuses on the injustices.
And Wendy, this is a follow-up to that question. Sorry, I forgot the key point. I was going to ask, how do you feel the media helps in perpetuating that?
Well, first of all, I don't think the media covers the whole issue very much. I think they avoid it. And it's so rare that it's almost non-existent to hear from a Palestinian in the media. I mean, they're just like the non-existent beings in this whole struggle. It's really an amazing thing. I think the media, corporate media does tend to go to the most powerful to get their comments as their first choice. But in this kind of conflict, it's just amazing to me how totally they have avoided any Palestinian voices on this issue. So I think that has to be dealt with, and maybe there needs to be a campaign on that of people writing to the media and saying, where is this other voice? I remember at one point we did do that. I think we wrote to CNN and said, you need to invite other voices on when you're discussing this situation.
Dr. Hatem?
Well, I do think that at least the pro-Israel segment, their immediate response is to label everything that is critical of Israel as anti-Semitic in order to stop and not actually engage in the critique that is there. So that's definitely part of the discourse. And the media is often reflecting and amplifying Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs press releases. So often even investigative journalism is out the window. We no longer have investigative journalism. So often the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs or even the Israeli Ministry of Defense put out a press release to the media that is there, whether it's in Tel Aviv or in Jerusalem, and your local reporters might write and maybe add Palestinian voices, but as it gets to your editors, it just begins to amplify and reflect Israeli public relations perspective. And this is done because the role of the corporate media is very important to put underneath corporate media, because 92% of the media is private, corporately owned. The same companies that own the media are the ones also are invested in military industrial complex, right? So we need to make those understanding that the role of the media, as Chomsky said, is to manufacture consent. And how you manufacture consent, you amplify the stories that actually are in line with power, while you suppress or actually don't even report the stories that needs to be reported. I always remind people that the New York Times reporter who reported on El Mizoto massacre in El Salvador, the New York Times pushed him out from the New York Times.
Really?
During when he reported it, and the Reagan administration and State Department complained on it, so he was pushed out. And 30 years thereafter, we discovered that what he reported was accurate. Not only that, but the US ambassador actually in El Salvador actually also documented and cabled about this information. So in here, the media was actually amplifying and confirming US policy in relations to El Salvador, right? The policy of supporting the Contras, the death squads, and that was the policy. So the person who reported from the ground ended up actually being shown the door from the New York Times, all the news that fit to print, except that which disagrees with power, right? So
I want to say something just
Yes.
positive about the New York Times right now was that I was really impressed that they put the faces of, I guess, the 69 children that had been killed mostly by Israeli bombing on the front page of the New York Times.
Yeah, we'll give them
that blew my mind.
We'll give them one pass with 100 negatives, because if you remember, for those who worked on the Iraq War, they gave what's her name, Judith Miller, 8 front page articles on pushing the Iraq War. And in one of the articles, and I don't know the editor, how he actually would allow a piece from her on the front page to say that a general told her that over there is weapons of mass destructions, right? Over there. And that was a front page piece in the New York Times pushing for the Iraq War. Again, after that, they apologized and said, we should have done better.
You know, another thing that I thought that I wanted to mention was that with the Israeli bombing of Gaza recently, one of their targets, one of their big targets was that high-rise building that housed, among other organizations, 2 major press outlets, AP and Al Jazeera.
Mm-hmm.
And I was kind of hoping, well, maybe out of this terrible, terrible thing, maybe one good thing that might happen might be that AP might have a slightly different take on what was on the events after being bombed. Unfortunately, the next bit of news that I got about AP was that they had just fired one of their reporters, Emily Wilder, for having made pro-Palestinian statements, tweets, whatever, in the past. And she was a JVP member at Stanford University. Yeah. And so, you know, I still need to reach out to her, but that was, you know, hey, they wanted to make sure that there was nothing anyone could point to that would show any kind of sympathy for Palestinians among the reporters. So that was bad.
Thank you both for recognizing that what's usually absent from the mainstream media coverage is any humanization of Palestine. You know, Palestinians, I should say, not Palestinians.
Just let me add, because the media is one of those areas that I have a whole field of work on it. And I always, for us to constantly make comparisons and understand that while we are dealing with the Palestine issue, is not unique to Palestine, right? And in order for us to create the solidarities, I want people to think how the Black person that is killed by the police, even up till today, how they are represented, right? As soon as the police kills a Black person, it is the history, the background of the Black person that becomes the subject of media analysis. They will begin to amplify his or her criminal record, whether they were actually have been put at any type of restrictions during school. They'll go 7 generations back to see if they have had any type of what you call infraction. In doing so, what is the media is doing is actually absolving the police from the killing of the Black person and making it a justifiable homicide. That's basically what is taking place, that the police bullet hit the right target. And I argue that what the media is doing is actually are erasing the Black person and killing him in our consciousness because he's dead. And their role is to actually kill that person in our mind. So the police officer shot 1 bullet, but the media reloads his gun time and time again in civil society to make it a justifiable homicide. The same dynamic is in relations to Palestine. So problematizing the Palestinians in order for us to send another $1 billion for Israel to use rockets against the Palestinians. So justifiable apartheid, justifiable homicide is the discourse. So we need to understand what is the role of the media in these discourses.
Yeah, well, thank you both for answering these questions. Thank you for being on our program. Unfortunately, I was going to say, we have so many great questions that I haven't been able to get to, but unfortunately we're out of time. So I just wanted to give some closing remarks that, as mentioned earlier, we are very grateful for both of our speakers. Thank you, Wendy, for discussing your portion and discussing how historic European anti-Semitism, this vilification of Jews with absurd racist myths, is something that Muslims can strongly relate to, and hopefully both our communities can sort of share in this solidarity, combating both Zionism and settler colonization in Palestine, as well as anti-Semitism, which, you know, are interlinked through this idea of intersectionality, that all our struggles, all these noble efforts are naturally interlinked. You know, kind of like the other things that you've done, you know, protesting for workers' rights and so on and so forth. And yeah, and thank you for also highlighting how that mythology was contradictory, how nonsensical white supremacy is, and how it produces ideas that often clash with themselves. And yeah, it was interesting hearing how Zionism conflicted with other leftist justice-oriented movements within the Jewish community. And we also greatly appreciate Dr. Hatem and his portion for highlighting that Muslims and Jews have a long history of shared experience and historical intersections that were hindered by an ethnic supremacist ideology. And most people don't think of British domination of Palestine as favoring utilizing Zionist colonization. You know, it's presented in history as if British were kind of even-handed in their treatment of Palestinians, but it was completely one-sided, and there was a sort of, I guess, colonial connection. And I just wanted to give a brief remembrance and prayer that we pray that justice and equity is realized within the entirety of historic Palestine and around the world. Pray that we are the divine's instruments of that justice and equity. And with that, I just want to conclude with a small dua, small supplication that we Muslims often say. Allahumma aslih ahwal al-Muslimin fi Palestine. Allahumma aslih ahwal al-Muslimin fi Palestine wa fi kulli makan ya dhul jalali wal ikram. And with that, I want to close with the surah. والعصر إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر. And thank you for joining us. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you.
Yeah, hopefully we can do more of these programs.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.